June 12, 2024, the day the clock started ticking. I remember the exact moment I realized we were standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than anyone in Washington was willing to admit. It wasn't the kind of event that makes headlines in the New York Times or leads the evening news, no dramatic press conferences, no generals in dress uniforms pointing at maps. Just a quiet, almost bureaucratic announcement from the White: the partial lifting of sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, in exchange for free and fair elections later this year. At first glance, it seemed like just another chapter in the long, sordid saga of U.S. intervention in Latin America, another attempt to squeeze a regime until it bends, another gamble that this time, the pressure would work. But then I dug deeper. And what I found wasn't just another failed policy. It was the opening move in a high-stakes geopolitical chess game that could, if mishandled, cost America its global position, its alliances, and quite possibly its future as a superpower. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of U.S. foreign policy, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony. I've written about the dangers of overreach in the Middle East, the folly of provoking Russia in its near abroad, and the economic suicide of decoupling from China. But this is different. Because what's happening in Venezuela right now isn't just about oil, or democracy, or even Latin America. It's about the endgame of a unipolar world and the desperate, reckless measures a declining empire will take to avoid the inevitable. And no one in the mainstream media is telling you the whole story. The official what they want you to believe. Let's start with the story Washington is selling. On the surface, it's a familiar. The Biden administration, under pressure from both progressives and pragmatists, has decided to ease some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector as a carrot to incentivize Nicolas Maduro to hold credible elections. The logic goes like Maduro is a dictator, but he's also weak. The Venezuelan economy is in shambles, hyperinflation has destroyed the bolivar, and the country's oil production, once the lifeblood of its economy, has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to barely 700,000 today. The U.S. has been squeezing Maduro with sanctions for years, and now, with global oil markets tight and gas prices creeping up again, the White House is betting that a little relief will be enough to force Maduro to the negotiating table. The official line is that this is a calibrated approach. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control issued a 6-month license allowing limited transactions with PDVSA, but only if Maduro takes concrete steps toward free elections. The State Department has been this isn't a full lifting of sanctions, just a temporary reprieve. We're not naive, a senior administration official told the Washington Post. Maduro is a survivor. But he's also cornered. This is our best shot at getting real concessions. The media has largely bought into this framing. The New York Times ran a piece calling it a high-risk, high-reward gamble, while the Wall Street Journal editorial board warned that Biden was rewarding bad behavior. Even the more hawkish outlets like the National Interest framed it as a necessary evil, a way to stabilize oil markets without fully embracing Maduro. But here's the problem with this: it's not just incomplete. It's dangerously misleading. The hidden what's really happening in Venezuela. Let me tell you what the official story leaves out. First, the idea that Maduro is cornered is a fantasy. Yes, Venezuela's economy is a disaster, but Maduro has survived far worse. He's outlasted the Obama administration's sanctions, Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and even a failed coup attempt in 2019. He's done it by diversifying his alliances, deepening ties with Russia, China, and Iran, and by turning Venezuela into a hub for illicit gold, drug trafficking, and sanctions evasion. The man is not a fool. He knows that if he gives an inch, the U.S. will take a mile. And he's not about to hand over power just because the White House offers him a 6-month oil license. Second, the sanctions relief isn't just about elections. It's about oil, but not in the way you think. The real story here is that the U.S. is running out of options to keep global energy markets stable. The war in Ukraine has disrupted Russian oil flows, OPEC Plus is cutting production, and U.S. shale growth is slowing. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. And right now, with prices creeping toward $100 a barrel, the White House is desperate to get that oil flowing again, even if it means dealing with Maduro. But here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. isn't just negotiating with Maduro. It's negotiating with Russia and China by proxy. Because Venezuela's oil sector isn't just crippled by sanctions, it's been propped up for years by Russian and Chinese state-owned comies. Rosneft, Gazprom, and CNPC have all invested billions in Venezuela's oil fields, and they're not about to let the US muscle in without a fight. So when the White House says it's calibrating sanctions, what it's really doing is testing how far Moscow and Beijing are willing to go to protect their investments. And that's the part no one in Washington wants to talk about. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for control of the global energy system, and the US is losing. The geopolitical how Venezuela became the next proxy war. To understand why this is so dangerous, you have to out. We're not just talking about one failed state in Latin America. We're talking about the front line of a new Cold War, a struggle between the US and its rivals for control of the 21st century's most critical resources. Let's start with Russia. For years, Moscow has used Venezuela as a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. Russian military advisors have trained Venezuelan troops, Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group have protected Maduro, and Rosneft has been the lifeline keeping Venezuela's oil industry afloat. In 2019, when the Trump administration imposed a full embargo on Venezuelan oil, Rosneft stepped in, buying up PDVSA's exports and rerouting them to Asia. When the US sanctioned Rosneft's Venezuelan operations, the Kremlin simply transferred them to a shell company controlled by the Russian state. Now, with the US easing sanctions, Russia does it allow American commies to move in, or does it double down on its support for Maduro? The answer, based on everything we know about Putin's playbook, is the latter. Moscow has no interest in seeing Venezuela fall into Washington's sphere of influence. If the US tries to muscle in, Russia will respond either by increasing military support for Maduro or by escalating elsewhere, like in Ukraine or the Middle East. Then there's China. Beijing has been Venezuela's largest creditor for over a decade, lending Caracas more than $60 billion since 2007. Most of that debt is backed by oil, meaning China gets first dibs on Venezuela's crude. And unlike the US, China doesn't care about democracy. It cares about stability. So when the White House says it's pressuring Maduro to hold free elections, Beijing sees it as a direct threat to its energy security. If Maduro falls, China's loans could go unpaid, and its oil supplies could dry up. This is the real geopolitical fault line. The US is trying to reassert control over Venezuela's oil, but it's doing so in a world where Russia and China have already staked their claims. And unlike in the 20th century, when the US could unilaterally impose its will on Latin America, today's multipolar world doesn't work that way. Every move the US makes in Venezuela will be met with a countermove from Moscow or Beijing. And that's a recipe for escalation. The military, why this could spiral out of control. Now, let's talk about the military side of this. Because if you think this is just about oil and elections, you're missing the bigger picture. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA to the 2009 coup in Honduras. And while the Biden administration has been careful to avoid direct military action in Venezuela, the infrastructure for intervention is already in place. The U.S. Southern Command has been conducting joint exercises with Colombia and Guyana, both of which share borders with Venezuela. The Pentagon has deployed additional assets to the region, including surveillance drones and special operations forces. And in 2020, the Trump administration even considered a military option to oust Maduro before cooler heads prevailed. But here's the: Venezuela is not Iraq. It's not Libya. It's not Afghanistan. It's a country with a battle-hardened military, a population that has endured years of economic warfare, and two nuclear-armed patrons in Russia and China. If the US were to launch a military operation, whether a limited strike or a full-scale invasion, it would not be a quick and easy war. It would be a quagmire. Let me be, I'm not saying the US is about to invade Venezuela tomorrow. But the risk of miscalculation is real. If Maduro feels cornered, he could lash out either by attacking US assets in the region or by provoking a crisis with Colombia or Guyana. If Russia or China decide to increase their military support, the US could find itself in a direct confrontation with two nuclear powers. And if the US responds with force, we could be looking at a regional war that destabilizes the entire hemisphere. The hawks in Washington will tell you that the US can handle it. That we've done it before. That we're the world's only superpower. But that's the same thinking that got us into Iraq and Afghanistan. And look how those turned out. The domestic political why this is really about the 2024 election. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the politics. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy isn't just about geopolitics. It's about the 2024 election. And that's where things get really dangerous. Let's start with the gas prices. With inflation still a major concern for voters, the White House is under immense pressure to bring down energy costs. Venezuela's oil could help if Maduro plays ball. But if he doesn't, and prices spike again, Biden's re-election chances take a hit. And that's why the administration is walking it needs Maduro's oil, but it can't be seen as soft on a dictator. Then there's Florida. The state is a must-win for both parties, and its large Venezuelan and Cuban exile communities are a powerful voting bloc. For years, these communities have pushed for a hardline stance against Maduro. If Biden looks like he's caving to the regime, he risks losing their support. But if he doubles down on sanctions and Maduro stays in power, he looks weak. And that's where Trump comes in. The former president has been hammering Biden on Venezuela, accusing him of selling out to Maduro. If Trump wins in November, all bets are off. He's already signaled that he wants to take a harder line on Venezuela, possibly even military action. And if he does, we could be looking at a full-blown crisis before the end of the year. But here's the neither side is being honest about the risks. The Biden administration is pretending this is just a calibrated approach, while the Trump camp is acting like regime change is just a matter of will. Both are wrong. And both are playing with fire. Scenario how this could unfold. So where does this go from here? Let's run through the most likely scenarios and why none of them end well for the US. Scenario 1, the controlled escalation. In this scenario, the US continues its current limited sanctions relief in exchange for electoral concessions. Maduro plays along, just enough to keep the oil flowing, but not enough to actually lose power. The US gets some oil, Russia and China keep their influence, and the status quo holds. It's not a great outcome, but it's the least bad option. The problem? It's unstable. Maduro could renege on his promises at any time. The US could reimpose sanctions, triggering a new crisis. And Russia and China could decide to up the ante, turning Venezuela into a permanent proxy battleground. Scenario 2, the proxy war. This is the most likely outcome. The US ramps up pressure on Maduro, but Russia and China respond by increasing their support. Venezuela becomes a flashpoint for great power competition, with the US backing opposition forces in Moscow and Beijing propping up Maduro. The result? A frozen conflict like Ukraine, but in Latin America. The risks here are enormous. A single miscalculation, a US drone strike gone wrong, a Russian mercenary attack on US personnel, could spiral into a direct confrontation. And unlike in Ukraine, where NATO is on the sidelines, in Venezuela, the US would be the primary actor. That means no off-ramps, no diplomatic exits. Just escalation. Scenario 3, the full-blown crisis. This is the nightmare scenario. The US decides to go all in either by imposing a full embargo on Venezuelan oil or by launching a military operation. Maduro responds by nationalizing US assets, cutting off oil exports, and calling on Russia and China for help. Moscow and Beijing, seeing an opportunity to humiliate the US, increased their military support. The result? A regional war that could draw in Colombia, Brazil, and even Cuba. The US would win in the short term, Maduro would fall, and the oil would flow again. But the long-term costs would be catastrophic. The US would be seen as an imperialist power, alienating allies in Latin America and beyond. Russia and China would use the crisis to rally support in the global south. And the US military, already stretched thin, would be bogged down in another endless conflict. The grand strategy why this is a symptom of a larger problem. But here's the real: none of this is happening in a vacuum. Venezuela is just the latest example of a much larger problem, the collapse of America's grand strategy. For the past 3 decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it can maintain global hegemony through military force, economic coercion, and ideological dominance. It's the doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should shape the world in its image. And it's failed. Spectacularly. Look at the Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. All of them were supposed to be quick, easy victories. All of them turned into disasters. And yet, the foreign policy establishment keeps doubling down. Why? Because the alternative, accepting that the US is just one power among many, is unthinkable. But that's the reality we're facing. The world is no longer unipolar. It's multipolar. And the US can't just bully its way to dominance anymore. If it tries, it will fail. And Venezuela is the perfect example of that failure. The US is trying to reassert control over a country that has already slipped into the Russian and Chinese spheres of influence. It's doing so at a time when its military is overstretched, its economy is fragile, and its alliances are fraying. And it's doing so with a domestic political system that rewards short-term thinking and punishes long-term strategy. This isn't just a policy failure. It's a systemic one. And if the US doesn't change course, it's going to keep making the same mistakes until one of them finally breaks the system for good. What should be done? A realist alternative. So what's the alternative? How does the US navigate this without triggering a catastrophe? First, the US needs to accept that it can't control Venezuela. Maduro isn't going anywhere, and Russia and China aren't going to abandon him. The best the US can do is manage the situation, contain the spillover, prevent a regional war, and protect its core interests. Second, the US should focus on diplomacy, not coercion. That means engaging with Maduro not as a friend, but as a necessary evil. It means working with Russia and China to stabilize the situation, rather than treating them as adversaries. And it means accepting that Venezuela's oil will flow to markets the US doesn't control. Third, the US needs to stop treating Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The region is no longer a US sphere of influence. If the US wants to maintain its leadership, it needs to do so through partnership, not domination. Finally, the US needs to rethink its grand strategy. The era of liberal hegemony is over. The US can't be the world's policeman anymore. It needs to focus on its core interests, protecting its homeland, maintaining its alliances, and managing great power competition without trying to reshape the world in its image. This won't be easy. It will require a level of humility and restraint that Washington hasn't shown in decades. But it's the only way to avoid the kind of disaster that's looming in Venezuela. The bottom America's gamble could cost everything. Let me leave you with the US is playing a dangerous game in Venezuela. It's a game with no good outcomes, where every move risks escalation, and where the stakes couldn't be higher. The White House thinks it can pressure Maduro into submission. It thinks it can outmaneuver Russia and China. It thinks it can control the outcome. But it's wrong. And if it keeps pushing, it's going to find itself in a crisis it can't control, a crisis that could drag the entire Western Hemisphere into war. And once the shooting starts, there's no going back. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of America's post-Cold War dominance in its own neighborhood. For decades, the US treated Latin America like a chessboard where it could move pieces at will: coups in Chile, invasions in AMA, economic strangulation in Cuba. But those days are over. The region has changed, and so has the world. The US is no longer the only player at the table, and its moves are being countered in ways Washington never anticipated. Let me explain why this matters. When the US sanctioned Venezuela's oil industry in 2019, it thought it could cripple Maduro's regime by cutting off its lifeline. Instead, it pushed Caracas straight into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. Russia sent in military advisors, Wagner mercenaries, and advanced air defense systems. China stepped in with billions in loans, infrastructure projects, and most critically oil for loans deals that kept Venezuela's economy afloat. The result? Today, Venezuela's oil exports are back to pre-sanctions levels, but they're flowing to China and India, not the US or its allies. The sanctions didn't break Maduro, they broke America's leverage. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is now in a position where it has to choose between two bad options. It can either double down on regime change and risk a direct confrontation with Russia and China, or it can accept that Maduro is here to stay and try to negotiate some kind of modus vivendi. Neither option is appealing, but the first one is downright reckless. Take the military dimension. If the US were to launch a full-scale invasion of Venezuela, it wouldn't be like Iraq or Afghanistan. This would be a war against a country that has spent the last decade preparing for exactly that scenario. Venezuela's military has been retooled with Russian and Iranian hardware, advanced S-300 air defense systems, Sukhoi fighter jets, and a network of coastal anti-ship missiles that could turn the Caribbean into a no-go zone for the US Navy. And let's not forget the irregular forces. Hezbollah has a presence in Venezuela, and Russian Wagner Group mercenaries have been training Venezuelan troops in asymmetric warfare. This isn't a military that's going to collapse under a few airstrikes. Then there's the regional fallout. Colombia, America's closest ally in South America, has already warned that it won't support a US invasion. Brazil, under Lula, has made it clear that it sees Venezuela as a sovereign nation, not a US protectorate. Even Mexico, which has its own tensions with Maduro, has refused to back regime change. The US would be going in alone, with no regional support, and that's a recipe for disaster. But the real danger isn't just the immediate military conflict. It's the long-term geopolitical shift that would follow. If the US invades Venezuela, it will confirm every fear that Russia and China have been spreading for years, that America is an imperial power that will use force to get its way. That narrative is already gaining traction in the global south, and a Venezuelan war would turbocharge it. Countries that have been on the fence about aligning with the West would have no choice but to side with Moscow and Beijing. The BRICS alliance would harden, the dollar's dominance would erode faster, and the US would find itself isolated in ways it hasn't been since the Cold War. And let's not forget the domestic consequences. A war in Venezuela would be a political nightmare for any US administration. The American public is war-weary after 2 decades in the Middle East. The last thing they want is another open-ended conflict in a country most can't even find on a map. The political backlash would be immediate and brutal. Congress would be in open revolt, the media would turn against the war within weeks, and the anti-war movement would explode. The US would be fighting not just Venezuela, but its own people. So why is the White House even considering this? Because the foreign policy establishment is stuck in a Cold War mindset. They see Venezuela as a domino that must be toppled, not a complex geopolitical problem that requires nuance. They think that if they just apply enough pressure, Maduro will crack. But he won't. He survived sanctions, coup attempts, and mass protests. He's not going to fold now. The real question is whether the US can afford to keep playing this game. Every day that passes without a course correction brings us closer to a point of no return. The Russians are digging in. The Chinese are extending their influence. And the Venezuelan military is preparing for the worst. If the US doesn't change its approach soon, it's going to find itself in a war it can't win, against enemies it can't outmaneuver, in a region it no longer controls. That's the gamble. And it's one that could cost America everything. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of America's domestic political consensus. The establishment still operates under the delusion that the public will rally behind a war if it's framed as a fight against communism, or drugs, or whatever the flavor of the month justification happens to be. But that playbook died in Iraq. The American people aren't stupid. They've seen this movie before, and they know how it with body bags, blown budgets, and a president who promised peace but delivered another quagmire. Let me explain why this matters for the 2024 election. If Trump or any president orders an invasion of Venezuela, he won't just be fighting Maduro. He'll be fighting half his own base. The MAGA movement is full of isolationists who voted for Trump precisely because he promised to end endless wars. They're not going to cheer for another regime change operation in Latin America, especially not one that looks like a repeat of the Bay of Pigs. And the left? They'll be in the streets within hours. We saw how quickly the anti-war movement mobilized against Syria in 2013, imagine that, but with the added fuel of a war that looks like pure imperialism. Here's the uncomfortable: the US political system isn't built for this kind of conflict. Congress hasn't declared war since 1942, and the authorization for use of military force from 2001 is so stretched it might as well be made of taffy. If the White House tries to bypass Congress, which it almost certainly will, we'll see a constitutional crisis. The courts will get involved. The states will start passing resolutions against the war. And the media? Oh, they'll have a field day. Remember how quickly the narrative turned on Afghanistan? That was a slow burn compared to what would happen with Venezuela. Within a week, you'd have pundits on CNN and Fox alike asking why we're risking American lives for a country that doesn't even have a functioning oil industry anymore. And let's talk about the military. The Pentagon is already stretched thin. The Army is struggling to meet recruitment goals. The Navy is dealing with a shipbuilding crisis. The Air Force is cannibalizing parts from old planes just to keep the fleet flying. Now imagine trying to launch a full-scale invasion of Venezuela, a country with a standing army of 120,000, a population of 28 million, and terrain that's a nightmare for mechanized warfare. The last time the US tried something like this was AMA in 1989, and that was a cakewalk by comparison. Venezuela has Russian anti-air systems, Chinese drones, and a military that's been preparing for this exact scenario for years. The casualty projections would be ugly, and the American public has zero appetite for body bags coming home from a war they never wanted. Now, the establishment will tell you that the US can win this quickly, with minimal losses. They'll point to Grenada in 1983 or Libya in 2011 as proof that America can still project power effectively. But those were surgical strikes, not full-scale invasions. Venezuela isn't a tiny island or a country with no air defenses. It's a nation that's been arming itself for years, with the backing of two nuclear powers. The moment US troops cross the border, Russia and China will start flooding the zone with weapons, intelligence, and cyber warfare. We're not just talking about a regional conflict anymore, we're talking about a proxy war with global stakes. And here's the: even if the US somehow wins the military battle, it loses the political war. Let's say we topple Maduro. What then? Do we install a puppet government? The last time we tried that in Iraq, it ended in disaster. Do we occupy the country? The American public will revolt. Do we hand it over to the opposition? The Venezuelan opposition is fractured, corrupt, and deeply unpopular. The country would collapse into civil war within months, and the US would be stuck holding the bag, just like in Afghanistan. The real question is whether the political class in Washington even cares. They've been insulated from the consequences of their decisions for so long that they think they can keep playing these games without paying a price. But the American people aren't as forgiving as they used to be. The backlash against the Iraq War didn't just end George W. Bush's presidency, it reshaped the Republican Party. The backlash against Afghanistan didn't just hurt Biden, it exposed the hollowness of the foreign policy establishment. A war in Venezuela would be the final nail in the coffin of the old consensus. It would prove, once and for all, that the people who run this country have no idea what they're doing. So where does that leave us? Right now, the White House is playing a dangerous game of chicken with Maduro, thinking that if they just turn up the pressure, he'll blink. But he won't. He's survived sanctions, coup attempts, and mass protests. He's not going to fold now. And if the US keeps pushing, the only thing that will break is America's global standing. The BRICS countries will harden their alliance. The dollar will take another hit. And the American people will look at their leaders with the same contempt they reserved for the architects of Vietnam and Iraq. This isn't just a gamble, it's a suicide mission. And the worst part? The people in charge don't even realize they're already losing. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the entire post-Cold War order crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The US foreign policy establishment has spent the last 3 decades operating under a simple, seductive that military power and economic coercion can reshape the world in America's image. But that assumption was always built on a lie. The lie was that the rest of the world would just accept it. That they wouldn't push back. That they wouldn't find ways to circumvent, undermine, or outright defy American dominance. And now, after years of overreach, from Iraq to Libya to Syria to Ukraine, we're seeing the backlash in real time. Let me explain why this matters. The US has two grand strategic options when it comes to Venezuela, and neither of them is good. The first is the path of more sanctions, more covert operations, more military posturing, and eventually, direct intervention. This is the path the hawks in Washington are itching for. They'll tell you it's about democracy, about human rights, about stopping a dictator. But we've heard that before. In 2003, they said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. In 2011, they said Gaddafi was about to massacre civilians in Benghazi. In 2018, they said Assad was using chemical weapons on his own people. And in every case, the justifications were flimsy, the intelligence was politicized, and the outcomes were catastrophic. Venezuela would be no different. The moment US troops cross the border, the narrative shifts. No longer is this about Maduro's crimes, it's about American imperialism. And the world will react accordingly. Here's the uncomfortable: the US no longer has the moral or material capital to pull off another regime change operation. The dollar's dominance is eroding. The BRICS alliance is growing. China and Russia are actively working to create financial systems that bypass US sanctions. And the global South, once cowed into compliance, is now openly defiant. Look at the numbers. In 2000, the US accounted for nearly 30% of global GDP. Today, it's around 25%. China's share has more than tripled in the same period. The US still has the world's most powerful military, but military power alone doesn't win wars anymore. It didn't in Vietnam. It didn't in Afghanistan. And it won't in Venezuela. What it will do is accelerate America's decline by forcing the rest of the world to hedge against US aggression. The second option is the path of dialing back the rhetoric, lifting some sanctions, and accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere. This is the path of realism, the path that recognizes that the US can't micromanage every crisis on the planet. But it's also the path that the foreign policy blob in Washington will resist with every fiber of its being. Because for them, de-escalation isn't just a policy shift, it's an admission of failure. It's an acknowledgement that the unipolar moment is over, that the US can't dictate outcomes anymore, that the world is moving toward multipolarity whether they like it or not. And that's a truth they're not ready to face. So where does that leave us? Stuck in a dangerous limbo, where the US is too committed to back down but not committed enough to win. And that's the worst of all worlds. Because in the absence of a clear strategy, the hawks will keep pushing for more pressure, more brinkmanship, more risk. They'll tell you that if we just squeeze a little harder, Maduro will crack. But he won't. He's survived worse. What will crack is America's credibility. Every time the US threatens military action and doesn't follow through, it looks weak. Every time it imposes sanctions that don't work, it looks impotent. And every time it backs a failed coup attempt, it looks desperate. That's not strength. That's the death spiral of a superpower that's lost its way. Let's be clear about this: isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. The US has two choices. It can double down on the same failed policies that have led to disaster after disaster, or it can accept that the world has changed and adapt accordingly. The first option leads to more wars, more debt, and more isolation. The second leads to something far more difficult but far more: a foreign policy that prioritizes diplomacy over coercion, stability over regime change, and long-term interests over short-term gains. But here's the thing about the foreign policy: they don't do difficult. They don't do introspection. They don't do humility. They do what they've always done, which is to assume that the next war will be different, that this time they'll get it right, that the American people will rally behind them. And that's the most dangerous delusion of all. Because the American people aren't rallying behind anything anymore. They're exhausted. They're broke. They're sick of being told that endless war is the price of freedom. And if the political class in Washington doesn't wake up to that reality, they're going to find themselves on the wrong side of history. I've been watching this play out for years now, and I'll tell you what keeps me up at night. It's not that the US will invade Venezuela. It's that they'll do it badly. That they'll stumble into a conflict they can't win, that they'll leave behind a failed state, that they'll hand China and Russia a strategic victory on a silver platter. And when it all goes wrong, they'll blame everyone but themselves. They'll blame Maduro. They'll blame the opposition. They'll blame the American people for not supporting the war enough. But they won't take responsibility. Because that's not how the establishment works. The question isn't whether the US can afford to invade Venezuela. The question is whether it can afford not to learn from its mistakes. And right now, the answer is a resounding no. The gamble isn't just about Venezuela. It's about whether America still has the wisdom to lead or whether it's too far gone to save itself. And if this is the best they've got, then God help us all.